Good morning and welcome back to the Extraordinary Technology Conference 2017. Today it is my pleasure to introduce to you to someone. He came on the scene about 3 or 4 years ago with some really fantastic information, some really detailed research. Mike Twichell is here to talk about how ether matters. Mike hails from the Cave Creek area of Phoenix, where he is a software engineer. He's written 2 books, one of which was ElectroGravity, which I've read, and he just came out with a new one called Ether Physics. I was thumbing through here, and I was amazed at the level of research and the information presented. So please give a warm welcome to Mike Twichell. Oh.
Thanks again. Oh, I'm live here on mic. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming. Big thanks to TeslaTech, John, Vernon, Steve, Elswick for inviting me, and Terry Brady, who invited me out here the first time. So I got a lot of slides. Let's get started here. This is my book. You can get for $20. Now I got this new book. This is not the right cover, but you can get for $39.99. And so this is when I've been here, 3 years now. I was talking about the ether. This is what we're going to be talking about, and some other things, but the ocean of ether, the Twichell atomic model, which is I also call the proton magnet model, ether water molecules, ether chemistry, and ether versus quantum. And we're also going to talk about sub-ether layers of space and what I call the slow surface paradox. So I like this, look at this picture of the cosmic web. I think most people have seen this. It's a simulation of our universe. So those bright strands are the dark matter where the galaxies reside, and then the empty space is the dark energy. So it's kind of like it reminds me of a neural network. But I think our connection into this web, if you will, is out the poles of the planets into the sunspots, in like a covalent bond, if you will, in the tree of life. In the Bible, it says, Jesus says, "I am the vine, my Father is the vine grower." So I put this "you are here" sticker there, because in my vision that I had, it drives the theory of gravity is that the galaxy was like the root tip meristem of a plant, and it was absorbing the soil of the universe. And plants have a vascular system, a xylem and a phylum. So the ether is being absorbed by the matter up into the xylem of this plant that forms our universe. What is the model that drives the theory? So, and then when the matter spins, it creates magnetism. This is all debatable, by the way. It's very philosophical. Here's I'm going to get into more non-philosophical stuff, but this is an actual root tip meristem of a plant, and if you notice, here's our heliosphere as our solar system moves through the Milky Way. Here's another view of our heliosphere as our solar system goes through the Milky Way. And if you notice right there, this is called Termination Shock. But it looks like bow shock when an object moves through a medium. The empty space people say there's no medium. They say it's empty. So how can you have this bow shock or termination shock? You can't, because there's a medium and there's the ether. So just one last thing on this plant idea. How does a plant root know which way to turn? turns away from the others to avoid competition for nutrients, and turns toward the nutrients and water, so it has to sense where the nutrients are. And our Earth is like a big eyeball, so and when we build these telescopes, we're looking into outer space. We're seeing these hydrogen clouds, which could be like fuel and nutrients for our space plant. So it's just a philosophical way of looking at what's going on, but it's commensurate with the theory of gravity too, because as you see this hydrogen cloud, this is the Eagle Nebula, and also this is called the Black Pillar Spire. It looks to me like a decomposing bug. It's kind of disgusting, but it's light years across, and stars are born on these hydrogen clouds. Stars aren't born in the middle of nowhere. So this makes you think, okay, what's this bug? What's it dissolving in? The answer is the ether, and water dissolves things. So ether and water have a lot in common, and I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you a live video of fish, 100,000 miles long, swimming out of the sun. I saw this on NASA on the undiscovered files. Let's let the video run here. But this tells us about ether chemistry, which is really cool. So this gives us a lot more flexibility than just ether particles. Now we think about ether molecules.
Solar magnetic bubble the size of Jupiter, full of superhot plasma. The only thing holding the ball in place is a magnetic field, which can shift at any moment.
Eventually they erupt, and that's what we're seeing at the end. This eruption off into space. So even though we don't see it here on Earth, there are these huge explosions going on in the sun all the time.
So he's calling them explosions. Now I've put it into a loop here.
And that's what we're seeing at the end. This eruption
Right there.
off into space. So even though we don't see it.
Hold on, I gotta replay it. It's supposed to loop. We're having technical difficulty. Okay, here.
And that's what we're seeing at
I'll
the
let you
end.
watch it a few
This
times. You really
eruption
gotta watch
off
close.
into space.
There's a couple of fish there, and one goes one way and one goes the other. Let's see. I'm not very good at working this left-handed.
Erupt, and that's what we're seeing at the end. This eruption
That's
off
right.
into space.
You see, it
So
just
even
goes.
though
You
we
see
don't
that gravity wave hits us, the surface of the sun. And the gravity wave went right across there as the two fish swam away. I'm from Minnesota, the land of 10,000 lakes, so I know what fish swim like, you know. And it's not an explosion like he says. He says it's an explosion, but explosions don't stop and then go again, and like these things did. So this is really quite amazing. And it's a biological universe. We shouldn't be that surprised, but these are bigger than Jupiter here. So why don't they melt? This is a good question. They're dark, about the color of the sunspots, which means they're at least 4,000 Kelvin. But if you put a sunspot out into the night sky, it's going to glow. It's very bright. It just looks dark next to the surface of the sun. So the reason they don't melt is because they're swimming in ether water, and they're made out of ether molecules. Just like you and I are made out of matter molecules and we swim in matter water, it's a layer of space smaller. So we have a smaller layer of space out there. And so I roughly estimated they swim 1 to 5 times the speed of light. And but then I noticed that the sun turned during the video. At first I thought it was instant and real time. So maybe it wasn't quite 1 to 5 times the speed of light, but still incredible. And so they're 100,000 miles long. They swim faster than the speed of light. They're made of ether molecules, and they swim in ether water. Now there's another video here. This one comes to the Earth.
Huge beam of light dancing.
I'll play it 3 or 4 times. You see it?
A huge beam of light.
Let me get this going here.
A huge beam of light.
See it swim off? Just like a fish. There it is. Looks like a fish. Swims like a fish. So it's amazing. This guy was out biking and he videotaped this. And there you see the shaped fish, and it's bright. It's very luminous because it's very hot. I estimated that it swam 95% of the way from the sun to the Earth to show up with this size in the sky, assuming that it was the same size as those other ones, 100,000 miles long. And it was kind of hovering right over a certain mound, so maybe it was looking for a worm, I don't know. It's Indiana, Illinois is where this mound is. Now this seemed appropriate, I don't know why. It's a magazine cover. But this old drawing from the 1700s, this is a fish out in outer, astrology, right? These fish of Pisces, and they're eating stars. So I guess we should hope that these fish we saw are whales and not minnows, because if the big ones come along. Also interesting is that these tails are connected, which reminds us of the cosmic web. Here's more video proving that there's full space, it's full of something, because there's things flying in it.
Moments after the optics appeared, NASA's light.
And suddenly you realize, well, wait a minute, there's something really bizarre going on here.
It's above the atmosphere.
Moments after the optics appeared.
It's got wings, it's flying.
Well, wait a minute, there's something really bizarre going on here.
Moments after the optics appeared, NASA's
You see, it's above the atmosphere.
cuts out.
So it's swimming in outer space, it's flapping its wings in the ether. Here's a space eel.
Writhing like a living being.
It was wiggling like a long worm in space.
And this is not the first time that a worm-like entity has been spotted near the shuttle.
Now it's so odd.
And then here's the sprites.
It's an incredible struggle.
They're like jellyfish.
The astronauts were in the right place at the right time to capture red sprites on film from space. It's an
You see that again?
incredible stroke of luck for NASA. The astronauts were in the right place at the right time to capture red sprites on film from space.
So, and they even saw snails on Pluto when they got out of Pluto. They don't swim in the ether, but I thought it was interesting, and it also tells us that scientists are now right. Here's our ether swimmers. We have fish in the sun, fish in the sky, space angels, space eels, and space jellyfish. So what does this tell us is this. Michelson-Morley experiment, who cares? I would rather see in my form of proof, visual proof like we just saw, than significant figures on a calculator. So that's that part. Now we're going to get into the real boring part. No, maybe not. We're going to review quickly ether gravity. This was my explanation of why the Michelson-Morley experiments failed, because you have nested whirlpools. So our solar system is like a whirlpool in the ether, and then our Earth has its own little whirlpool. So when the Earth went to the other side of the sun 6 months later, there was no difference in the speed of light, because they thought that's... So that Michelson-Morley was based on a poor premise of a static ether, when it's really a flowing ether. And it also, with ether gravity theory, they have a constant flux as the matter object is absorbing the space around it. So because it's moving into a smaller volume, it has to accelerate. And that gives it the acceleration that's based upon Bernoulli's principle. Just like water through a tapered pipe would accelerate, the smaller portion of the pipe would have faster, and the water particles would separate as they try to speed up to keep that flux the same. And when they separate, just like air over wing of a plane, that gives it lift. So gravity is like electromagnetic lift. With the Coriolis force, you could think of the ether whirlpool as like an ether wind. At the equator is the maximum speed, so this creates the Coriolis. And you can also think of magnetism, one aspect of magnetism, as wind shear, which is kind of an interesting way to look at it. Now, this theory explains why solar systems are flat, why spiral galaxies are flat, because around the equator it's spinning faster, so there's lesser pressure because the particles are separated, and that gives lesser pressure. Things are attracted to that. Not just matter, like Saturn's rings, you know, the rocks and ice going around Saturn, but also ether is attracted to it, as we're going to see when I talk about the pole vacuum theory. Also with the ether gravity theory is this bubble at the core concept, because you have a 4/3 pi r cubed sphere absorbing the ether, but it can only get in through the surface area, which is 4 pi r squared. So it's a factor of r off. So when it grows too fast or it grows to a certain size, you can get a bubble, which explains the supernova and the standard candle, because it would implode and then explode. Also, smaller layers of space could still make it through there, so that it almost acts like some kind of a filter. So it explains relativity, because it's a fluid dynamic. It's equations that are very similar to the electromagnetic equations. Einstein Conspiracy is just an idea I had that where Einstein, they made him a media mogul because he was propounding the empty space theory, because the full space ether theory was a matter of security and national defense. So they didn't want people to know about the ether, because you can build anti-gravity and weapons with it. So with the full space model, you can explain inertia. This is a lead ball through salt water, but I like to think of it as a proton through the ethers. The ether's raining down above, pouring down above us. It's like tiny rain, tiny water. And this is your drag bubble, just an example. It wouldn't be that big, but with the full space model, or the empty space model, you cannot describe inertia. Anything that changes the size or orientation of this drag bubble would be considered a force. So why does objects go at constant velocity through this super dense ether and not slow down? And I wrestled with this one for quite a while, but I came up with this tiddlywink effect. So you get an equal but opposite force because nature hates a vacuum, so it wants to fill that in. So it'll give it an equal but opposite force in that direction. When it's coming down, it can't have an equal but opposite force because the density of the ether is changing with every tiny little sliver of space is being sucked into the Earth. But with just an object, it can. So, but it's not 100% efficient because we see the Pioneer anomaly. So now we're going to talk about the Twichell atomic model, proton magnet model. So here's what you always see. Hydrogen, that's a proton, and then there's an electron. So this is unbalanced. And there's an unbalance between the mass is 1/1800th for an electron versus that of a proton, but the charges are supposed to be equal and opposite. And we're supposed to believe this. And they give us the same stuff, proton +1 charge, -1 charge. There's no resolution to their charges. And the same stuff with opposite charges attract, same charges repel. We've heard it all. It's like a broken record. So with this proton magnet model I come up with, it explains it actually has 2 electrons per proton. So you have a spinning, it's like a vortex, and it has and the poles of the magnet are the electrons. So this really just simplifies everything. And as we're going to see, the quarks and gluons are also the poles of the proton magnet, but just measured closer to the source. And here's black hole magnet, active galaxy magnets. Because nature is fractal, the proton is a magnet as well. So I'd like everybody to do this. You put your finger up in the air and you look at the ceiling and you make like circles above your head, about maybe a foot big circles with your index finger. Now slowly lower your arm below your eye line, real slow. Keep the circles going. Okay, now look, which way is your hand going now? It's going the opposite way. Look at your hand, go below your eye line. Now look at which way your hand's going. It's going the opposite way. You didn't change the direction of the vortex, you just changed your perspective. So it went from clockwise to counterclockwise, but how did it do it? It was just your perspective change. This is the difference between positive and negative charge. And with the proton vortex model, we can explain this. Very simple. Here's a little drawing I spent a long time on. No, just kidding. Here's Mr. Clockwise. He sneezes. The germs go clockwise. And Mr. Counterclockwise, he says, bless you. But when he sees the germs, they're going counterclockwise. So it's all in your point of view. These proton magnets are like little Legos that you can just put them together and form molecules. Like here's plasma, where it's directly connected, like beads. And then here's H2, where it's formed into a loop. We're going to show a few simple examples of molecules. Another cool thing about this model is neutrons really don't exist. They're just protons with their poles already connected. So they're not magnetically interacting, which means they're not chemically interacting. Another thing that's cool about this is physics is trumping chemistry. So if you don't understand chemistry but you like physics, now you can understand chemistry. Here's this last proton to join the nucleus still has one pole coming out, and this would be your free electron. So there's your free electron. And here's your electron cloud would just be the magnetic fields emanating from the bonds and the loops in the nucleus. With this model that I call the ionic, what they call ionic bond, I'm calling a direct bond. And with what they're calling a covalent bond, I'm calling a loop bond. For instance, here at the top, hydrogen is reactive. Its poles are exposed. It's magnetically reactive, which means it's chemically reactive. But down here, when two of them bond up in a covalent bond, they're not reactive because their poles are taken. Also with this model, to explain hydrogen bonding, I call this wrapping bond because when two protons spinning the same way, their gravitational whirlpools will interact, and it'll be like inductance. If they're going the same way, they're going to want to wrap around each other. If they're going opposite ways, they're going to want to repel. And we see that with water. The hydrogen bond of water, as molecules bounce around, they, you'll see this come and go as the molecules bounce around each other. That's the hydrogen bond. And of course, there's James Bond. So I drew some water molecules with my proton magnet model. So you see the little hydrogens connected to the oxygens, and you see the hydrogen bond here. So as this proton is spinning, the gravitational whirlpool is interacting with this magnetic fields of the electron cloud of this oxygen here. So we can draw methane. It's a simple model, simple molecule. I'm saying this stick thing is misleading because it looks like a straight-on direct bond, but it's actually, if you draw it with the model, it's supposed to be a covalent bond, which is a loop bond, and it would look more like that. So with this model, there's lots of things that support the proton magnet model. I can't find anything that doesn't. For instance, plasma supports it. You heat it up, it stretches out. You cool it down, it comes back together. What they call hydrogen recombination. How do they explain that with their current atomic model? I have no idea. So we're going to use this proton magnet model to get in a battle with quantum at the end of this presentation. So don't change your channel, because I have the channel changer anyway. So let's talk about the fabric of space. There's a guy named Leeds Scalman who built the Coral Castle in Florida in the 50s, and he levitated 30-ton rocks all by himself, working at night so nobody could see his secret. And he was the king of magnetism. He seemed to really understand magnetism. And he wrote this little book called Magnetic Current. Now, we're going to read directly out of this book. Funny, he says the first sentence is, this writing is lined up so when you read it, look east. I read it looking east one time. It seemed like it worked better. But so he says, the metal is not the real magnet. The real magnet is a substance that is circulating in the metal. Each particle in the substance is an individual magnet by itself, and both north and south pole individual magnets. They're so small that they can pass through everything. In fact, they can pass through metal easier than air. They're in constant motion, running one kind of magnet against the other kind, and if guided in the right channels, they possess perpetual power. They are a cosmic force. They hold together the Earth and everything in it. So when I read this, and he said that these tiny particles are moving through everything and that they're magnets, I thought, well, I'm talking about ether particles streaming down into the Earth as the Earth is absorbing the space around it. So why he's talking about my particles, but I never thought of them as magnets. So this is when I realized that there must be a layer of space smaller than the ether layer, I call it the sub-ether, because you can't have a magnet. A magnet is when something is absorbing the space around it and spinning. So if you have an ether particle that's a magnet, that means you must have a sub-ether layer of space even smaller than that it can absorb while it's spinning so that it can be a magnet. So this is when I realized the existence of layers of space and the existence of the sub-ether layer. He says, each kind of the magnets are coming out of their own end of the pole, running around, and are running in the other end of the pole and back at its own end. And then over and over again. I don't know how much I agree with all this, but he says, all the individual magnets do not run around. Some run away and never come back, but new ones take their place. The Earth is a big magnet. So you put a permanent magnet on the table, it's got a bunch of atoms in there that are lined up, right, creating the magnetic field, the alignment of the magnet, and the ether's rushing down through it. Some of it, most of the ether is probably just going to go right through the magnet. Some of it's going to get caught up in a spin and then continue on into the Earth, and then some of it's going to get caught up in a spin and he doesn't say this here, but it's going to get caught up in a spin, gets sucked into the proton, down the throat of the proton and back into the tree of life, into the cosmic web. But now we know about the sub-ether. If ether particles are magnets, that must mean there's a sub-ether. And if there's a sub-ether, then that allows for sublight, which would travel faster than the speed of light because it's smaller, denser particles, just like light is faster than sound. Which we'll find out later can help us explain quantum entanglement, because they see speeds of very fast speeds, 10,000 times the speed of light with quantum entanglement. So what's the fabric of space? It's not a matrix, because that's man-made. Man invented the line. So, and it's fluid. We saw the fish swimming in it. So we know that it's like water. And we have a good source to vouch for us that it's water, because on the first page of the Bible, God said, God created the firmament to separate the waters above from the waters below. So outer space is like tiny water. And then if there's layers of space below that, there could be even tinier water within that. Here's a picture I found on the internet. Waters above, waters below. So this ether water molecule theory, it helps us to explain the sheets. Why do the auroras have the sheet fabric shape? Why is it all vertical curtains? And because gravity is so much like electricity. Gravity is basically electricity at a different scale. So the Earth's gravity is acting like electricity and performing electrolysis on these ether water molecule H's and O's, separating the H's from the O's, and then these H's would then string together into a plasma, which would then explain the sheet structure of space. So the ether water molecule thing also helps us explain the dark energy voids, because deep space is very cold. And what do we know about water when it freezes? It expands because of the geometry of the two H's and the O. So if the space is tiny water and it's freezing in outer space, then it's going to expand, and that's going to explain these dark energy voids that they can't explain why the universe is accelerating. Because the more it freezes, the more it's going to freeze. The bigger it gets, the more it's going to freeze, and then it's going to accelerate. Because it's about the surface area. So inside the strands of the dark matter that's inside the cosmic web, not the dark energy in the voids, but in, in the strands. So we're going to see this ether water. It's going to undergo state changes. It's going to turn into ether steam. We're going to see electrolysis on it. And then as it gets ripped apart and pulled apart, stretched, and turned into, the bigger layers of space are going to get filtered out, and the smaller layers of space will be left for the bond, for all the connections, interconnections. Let's talk about torsion fields. So I just found out about torsion fields, and it really matches well. So that's why I added it to my book and my speech, because it seemed to make sense to me. Now the academics call it a scam, so we should actually find that encouraging. But let me just read it. A torsion field is a feature of the theory of energy which the quantum spin of the particles can be used to cause emanations lacking mass and energy. We're going to talk about that. To carry information through vacuum, and we're going to talk about vacuum, orders of magnitude faster than the speed of light. Okay. From Wikipedia again, the question of gravity's source remains. In Newtonian gravity, the source is mass. In special relativity, mass turns out to be part of a more general quantity called energy momentum tensor, which includes both energy momentum densities as well as stress, pressure, and shear. So I don't know how these empty space people sleep at night, because how can you have density, stress, pressure, and shear in empty space? So they want their cake and eat it too, But as we're going to see, is that everything seems to boil down to gravity being very closely related to vortices, and the formation of these vortices is stretching and creating this torsion. So this is Einstein's equation. If you look, there's only one variable here. This is not complicated. All these others are constants. Now, the speed of light is not constant. It depends on the ether density. But if your ether density is constant in one location, then it is. So this is really just says gravity is equal to torque. Here's a solar system I found on the internet of our sun moving through the Milky Way with the planets spinning around it. So our solar system is a lot like a torsion field and a lot like an electric current. So torsion fields supposedly go 109 times faster than the speed of light. Now what they're talking about is this vertical axis here, so at the poles. But when they say it doesn't carry mass or energy, mass is relative to your layer of space. So we're going to talk about that at the very end. I'm going to describe how that works. And this torsion fields can also explain this ring, as we see. Why do we see a ring there? So gravity, we actually, this is kind of a duplicate, but Coriolis force is at the heart of magnetism. Gravity is the ether wind, and magnetism is like the wind shear. And this is all related to the torsion as well. Now the proton magnet, I say the electron is the pole of the magnet. So what the electron has, the academics say the electron has no known components or substructure. So we know that it's vacuum, which matches our model. Now everybody stare at this really hard and then pass your wallets to the right. And then my mother, she's in the back row, she's going to come pick them up. So why is there a vacuum at the pole? And we can explain this with the full ether gravity's model, because as I was saying, is the equator, Bernoulli's principle, things are attracted to the rotating equator, right? And like Saturn's rings are flat, matter's attracted to it. So ether from the poles is also going to be attracted to it and get pulled down toward the equator, giving us a vacuum at the poles. Here's the Foucault pendulum at the South Pole. The Foucault pendulum just reminds us that, when it goes 360 degrees every day at the poles, but it just goes back and forth at the equator, it just reminds us of this torque that's happening. It's like as our cosmic web is being wound and threaded, we're not really aware of it as it's weaving into the tree of life. Here we see spider web galaxies. And there's not enough time in this to go over this, but in my book I describe this in detail. It's a really interesting painting. And here's just Leonardo da Vinci's drawing. So connections are everything. Now I came up with this concept I call flux theory, because big things are spinning slowly, and then smaller you get, the faster it spins. Protons are spinning so fast they can't even measure them. And ether is going to spin even faster. As we see, why does a boson have such a huge mass? It's because it's an ether particle, and so the smaller you get, the faster it spins, which tells us there must be a flux coming through the poles of the Milky Way, and then it's sort of just makes its way through the whole galaxy. It's kind of an interesting thought. Now, my version of torsion fields I call black strand theory, and I call that because of the black holes, like the interconnecting of black holes. Even protons can be black holes. Anything that separates the medium of light, as it's sucking it in, so the particles aren't touching, they can't vibrate anymore, then they can't transmit their vibration. This is a black hole, but let's just go over these bullets. Black strands are invisible. They represent the bonds. They're the poles of the magnet. They contain vacuum in smaller layers of space, the subethers. Larger layers of space absorb, spin, and strip away the layers, leaving the smaller layers for the bond. So when I was studying gravity, I came across this what I call a slow surface paradox. Don't try to read that. I'm a little short on time anyway. So this is a plot of the solar system speed. Here's Pluto, and as you move in toward the sun, Mercury is going very fast up here. But the surface of the sun is moving incredibly slow. So it's like, what is going on? I thought this seemed like a paradox, right? If you have a whirlpool, it's spinning faster and faster, but then suddenly it seems like it reached the bottom of the whirlpool at the surface of the sun. There it is there in table format, but you see it with Jupiter. If you extrapolate the moons of Jupiter, you see that the surface is slow. If you extrapolate Saturn's moons, you see the surface is slow. And if you extrapolate for Uranus, you see that the surface is slow. So this just gives us a huge clue into what's going on. We just don't know how to interpret it, but look at this plot of a tangential velocity of a vortex. You see the same plot. So this just gives us more proof that our solar system is like a vortex. And it even proves the proton magnet model, because this is electron distribution chart has the same look, which proves our proton magnet model that the atom is a vortex. So when we see this slowing down of the sun's surface, we have to wonder, is the sun surface kind of like a stadium wall of a hurricane, an electromagnetic hurricane? When you look into the sun, you see these black, it's dark in there. You can see holes. It seems like there's nothing in there. So it's curious. This is the eye of a hurricane, and then if you notice this next slide, it looks just like a magnet. This last one, see the cold's coming down the middle, the hot's coming up the side, and then at the North Pole you have cold temperatures coming down, and it seems very, very similar. With this hurricane anatomy, you also have, so here's your big hurricane, you also have these smaller mesovortices, which remind us of the planets, if this was our solar system. So there's something going on here, and in my book I put forward all these hypotheses. The one I just kind of briefly touched on here was the cyclone one, which is the best one, but there's other ways to look at what's going on. This I'm going to skip because I've timed my presentation, and I know that, but heat is relative to rotation and friction. You can't explain that with empty space model, that friction around the. Now I have to skip a few things to get, oops, wait. I do want to talk about this. If you vibrate a plate and put sand on it and then change the frequency, you'll see these different patterns with this form where the standing waves are. It's really quite amazing. And we have to know that this is happening in the ether too. We just can't see it in a three-dimensional as the vibrations of the ether occur in tiny levels. I'm skipping that, I'm skipping this, and I'm just going to say here that briefly, they saw two black holes collide, and then they measured 0.002 ferrometers distance change with the lengths of one of their arms in the interferometer, and they, it seems kind of lame to me. I mean, we saw the fish in the sun, we saw those waves, and we know the space is full, but these empty space people, they get real confused when it comes to gravity waves, This looked like gravity waves to me, and this electricity and gravity are very similar. I talked about that. So now here I get to the main event, ether versus quantum. So you've heard a lot of quantum, quantum this, quantum that. It's very complicated, and I've actually found a way to simplify it with this model. So these the empty space people think that each one of these things is a particle, because how else could it be, right? Space is empty. But we know that this space is full of ether, tiny water, if you will. When they collide them, these are just little whirlpools, little vortices from the collision. So with the full space model, you have a much better way of understanding these collisions. Now here the quantum physicists are sorting things out. They are. I think she found a muon or something down there. And then, of course, here they are trying to explain with the empty space what's going on. But, we give them credit, pat them on the back. They perform incredibly complex experiments, and they come up with what seems like the correct information. But then they just blow the interpretation with the empty space model. Just like Tommy Boy blows his sail. So they come up with all these particles: lepton, hadron, boson, gluon, meson, graviton, photon. It's just, the list goes on, and this is just a short list. So I thought, these guys are having all the fun. I want to invent some particles too. So I invented mine down here: the stoop on, the put on, the load on, the crap on, and the dump on. So thank you. Be here all week. So when I first came into this quantum, it was very complex, and I hated quantum. I always hated it, but I was going to write about it in my book, so I had to research it. So, here's a hierarchy. At least they categorized the particles, right? And I found out that this is just electrons, ether, and protons here. So that right away gives us back in our comfort zone. And we talked about protons spinning and creating the electrons or the poles of the magnet in the fluid ether. So now it's getting even simpler. And it gets even simpler when you consider that the proton could be the only real particle, an absorbing spinning vortex. So basically vortices in the matter layer of space, in the ether layer of space, in the sub-ether layer of space is only the proton. So I actually think this is important, as I called it, the grand unified theory, fractal proton magnet layers of space. So here we're going to talk about the quantum again. They collide stuff together with the collision, and this makes a really big mass with the top quark. Now, what's colliding is in this square here is the proton, so it's smaller, and when they collide it, they see this giant mass here. So what's going on? Why is it? Here it is here in table format. You see the proton down here, and then the top quark is 170 times more massive than the proton. That's the mass of tungsten. How is this happening? And I'm going to skip that. But the boson and so poor spin resolution. They dump them into these big buckets, right? I mean, nothing in nature is this integer-like. We know they can't measure. They can't separate mass and spin. So to measure mass, they inject a particle of known speed into a known magnetic field, and they measure the displacement. But the spin is kind of blocking the way. Is the spin the mass, or is the mass creating the spin? It's all intertwined. They can't separate it out. So when they smash these particles together and they go spinning, that looks like a big mass. You can see the masses are the m's here, and these q's down here are the charges. This is Coulomb's law, but the charges are the spins. So you see mass and spin are really, spin is closely related to the mass phenomena. So collapsing space looks like mass. When they smash the particles together, and then they send a vortex out that's got some vacuum in it, and then the space collapses. That looks like mass. But it's not a repeating mass. This is the key. See, only the proton is repeating the absorption, the mass phenomena, because it's only the proton that's connected to the tree of life. So they find quarks inside the proton. And what I'm saying is that these quarks are the poles of the proton magnet. You have the up quark and the down quark are just the poles of the proton magnet. And this third quark, it could easily be the rotational gravitational field of the proton as it's spinning. You notice how it's kind of on a boom arm. You can almost see it. So this model is very simple. Here's my proton magnet. I put the quarks inside like they're supposed to be, up quark, down quark. And then this looping, this rotation would be the third quark. And the gluon, electron and quark, these are all parts of the proton magnet. It's just how close they're measuring it from. This guy can tell you the closer you measure something from, the stronger it gets. So the quark pulls the proton magnet with quark, gluon, and electron as you're going farther out. And we're going to see how this works. We're going to simulate a collision here. Here's our proton magnet model. And then here's a collision that's going to energize the vortices. And we're going to look at these pieces here. So these are excited vortices in the ether with extra spin and extra vacuum, but they're not new particles. So if you smash two spheres together, unless they hit dead center, you're going to create extra spin, right? And that extra spin is going to energize the vortices. These are not new particles. But they say the muon, which is supposed to be a separate particle, is an excited state of the electron with a lifetime of 2.2 microseconds. Okay? They also say that the tau particle is a much heavier version of the electron with 2.9 times 10 to the minus 13 lifetime. So they don't last, and what happens is this. After this very small amount of time, the energized proton goes back to this. What the academics call this is the transformation from a higher mass state to a lower mass state. And they give it a fancy term, and they call it hadronizing. Well, because the hadron is the category that contains the proton, so they call it hadronizing. But really, it's just the proton magnet just went back to its normal state after being excited and collided. Sometimes they hit them together so hard that they blow the tops right out the poles. And this is what they're saying is that the top quark is very massive, right? Now, if you're a hollow Earth person, then you should be a hollow proton person as well, because everything's fractal, right? So, it could be that they when they hit these protons dead on, they just knock the stuffing out of them, shoves all the vacuum out of them, blows the tops off, and then they think it's a separate particle, and they call it the top quark, 170 times the mass of the proton or the mass of tungsten in this thing. Now, we know it's just a vacuum, it's just empty space. It's going to collapse, and we'll see that here. So it's the mass of tungsten. Top quark nonsense. The consistent failure of free quark searches. So they're searching for free quarks, but they can only find them inside the proton. Top quark does not, they think they found one with this top quark. Top quark does not form hadrons, so it's not going to go back to the proton, giving physicists a unique opportunity to study a bare quark, and all other quarks hadronize. So, but this is sad because it's not really anything. It's just going to collapse. It's just a vortice in the ether. They're not going to find anything there. And then the end result, this one doesn't have to call it Mount Baldy. So after a few brief, tiny billionths of a second, it'll go back to proton magnet. After its top quarks were blown off, and what they call that is when you do separate a quark from other quarks, the energy in the gluon field is enough to create another quark pair. So basically, they're saying the proton magnet just became the proton magnet again. And the reason it does this is because it's connected to the tree of life. So the proton regenerates its vortices. So, thank God, I think I don't have to talk about vortices anymore. Let's talk about waves. So, when this collision happens, they're saying more particles are happening. They're calling them virtual photons. Virtual photons are really just waves in the ether. A photon is a wave in the ether, and they're saying these virtual photons are coming from the collision. But they're really, they're not particles, they're just waves in the ether, is all it is. It's just light, it's gravity waves. It's a disturbance in the ether. Another thing they're doing wrong is they're saying antiparticles are being confused with the other end of the vortex. Same mass, opposite charge. So the electron, down here, they would probably say that was a positron, right? But they're not calling it a vortex, so they're just inventing twice as many particles for us to understand. So I forgot to talk about the weak force is gravity. Is those vortices that I was showing you, they collapse space, compresses them down because space is pressurized. And what happens is that's the weak force. That's gravity. And your strong force is magnetism. So there's just magnetism, and gravity is really all we have to worry about. All these other forces they're inventing are just because they have an invalid empty space model, so they're inventing these other forces. But gravity causes magnetism, we think, so it could be that there's just one force, and that would be gravity. Although this is kind of seems debatable. So keep it simple. Oops, did I pass something? No, okay. But they entangle it, they make it complicated, and they get really confused with their empty space model when they measure something and then it changes some other property because they think space is empty. Well, we know when you stick a thermometer into the water, it's going to disturb the water. So this is not rocket science for us, right? Because we're full space people. But with this quantum entanglement, they see 10,000 times the speed of light between particles. So what is this? Let's find out. So one particle is found to have clockwise spin on a certain axis. The spin of the other particle measured in the same axis will be counterclockwise, as is expected due to their entanglement. So this is just what we talked about. You look at it one way, it's clockwise. You look at it from the other side, it's counterclockwise, right? So it makes it seem like these two particles are connected through the pole. So we can explain this with our models as two ways. One is the torsion field, right? Or my version of torsion field I call black strand. Or we can explain it with the subether. So torsion fields is through the poles, but they hypothesize 109 times, not 10,000 times the speed of light. And black strand is through the poles. But subether is a broadcast, it's light, it's sublight. So I'm not that familiar with these entanglement experiments. All I can say is that we have ways of explaining with our model. So the ether gets no respect, you know. Everything is the ether, and I'm going to get into this, but Higgs reinvented the ether, basically. The Higgs field is the ether. Now, the Higgs boson, one of the Higgs bosons is a photon. It's categorized that way. Now, we don't like the photon emission model. This is the light source emits the photons, and they go at the speed of light, unimpeded forever through empty space. And it's just a dumb model, because we know that a little vibration in the medium, and the density of the ether, the density of the particles in the medium is what's controlling that speed of the wave and the vibration in the medium. So we don't like the photon emission model. But we can, with this layers of space concept that I came up with, we can explain zero rest mass. Because if you imagine, and here's what I talk about, mass being relative to R. So mass to us is when matter absorbs the ether, right? That's mass. But if you're an ether particle, the mass to you is when you're absorbing the sub-ether, right? So for us, these ether particles, they look, if they move, then it creates an opening, and then other particles will move in. That's going to look like mass to us. So that's why when they're sitting still, like those giant fish I was showing you 100,000 miles long, since they're made out of ether, if they were sitting still, they could be massless by our definition, because they're made out of ether and their molecules are absorbing the sub-ether. So by our definition, those giant fish would be massless, which is pretty funny. I mean, can you imagine catching a fish that big and you put it on a scale and you tell all your buddies and it shows 0 pounds, you know? And the graviton is the same thing. It's a stress energy tensor. It has to do with this vortex. So probably the smartest thing I've read from these academics is this. According to current theory, all particles would be massless if there would be no Higgs field. The Higgs field creates a drag for particles like some sort of molasses. Now we know this molasses is tiny water, right? Some particles feel more drag, resulting in more, some less, resulting in less. So is not this just the same as my simulated proton here with, this is a lead ball and this is salt water? Yeah, no, it's you see the streaming down? This is a salt water. It's a lead ball moving through salt water, creating a drag, a pocket of drag behind it. And so this is how we have to look at inertia and the ether and mass. So, but the ether is the Rodney Dangerfield of physics. It gets no respect. Photons is the ether, gravitons is the ether, Higgs field is the ether, dark matter is the ether, 0-point energy, it's all the ether. So it's just getting no respect at all. So now we're closing up here. Here's my quantum glossary. Quantum means ancient Latin, meaning how to overcomplicate something. Quark is the pole of the proton magnet. Gluon is the pole of the proton magnet. Electron is the pole of the proton magnet. Positron is the pole of the proton magnet. Neutrino is ancient Latin. Photon is the ether. Graviton is the ether. Well, actually, photon's a wave in the ether. Graviton is the ether. Higgs field, ether. Dark matter, ether. 0-point energy, ether. Virtual particle, wave in ether. Energy, the life force. And neutrino, still ancient Latin. So we find out that the universe sucks. Mass is closely related to inertia. Inertia is closely related to drag. Drag is closely related to vacuum. Vacuum is closely related to gravity. Gravity is closely related to magnetism. And magnetism is closely related to vacuum. So the universe sucks. So if you have really good eyes and can read really fast, this is my references. But Da Vinci said simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So our model is simple. That means it must be sophisticated. He also was quoted as saying, the proton magnet model rocks, and buy ether physics for just $39.99. So, so I'll take questions.
Thank you very much, Mike Twichell.
Thank you.
If you have questions, why don't you come on up to the green square?
Here's my new book, by the way. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Out at the table.
Thank you very much, Mike Twichell. That's some profound information there and just exhaustive research. We really appreciate that. I think that the references in that presentation are going to go a long ways when we start working more and more with the ether and as we get a better understanding. All right. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back at 11 o'clock.
Okay.